Hello, my name is John Marenbon and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at Trinity College, Cambridge, and also an Honorary Professor of Medieval Philosophy in the University of Cambridge, and also a visiting professor at the University of Italian Switzerland in Lugano. It's another thing I do. And I'm going to be talking to you today about Boethius, eternity and the problem of prescience. And I want to start off with the simple question of who was Boethius. There are probably two things which is helpful to bear in mind if you're thinking about who was Boethius. The first is the date, 476, which was the date of his birth. The second is that he was born into the highest aristocracy of Rome. 476 is an important date because it coincided with the deposition of the last Western Roman Empire. So by Boethius' time, the empire was divided into the West, centred on Rome, and the East, centred on Constantinople. But the Western Empire had declined and declined, and throughout Boethius' life, it was ruled by the Goths. The ruler for all of Boethius' adult life was Theoderic, an Ostrogoth who'd been educated in Constantinople and was mostly, but unfortunately for Boethius not all the time, a rather good ruler, it seems. He and his Goths were Christians, but they were Arian Christians. They had a different Christology from the Catholic Christians of both Rome and Greece. And in general, Theoderic's policy was to keep himself and his Gothic soldiers separate from the aristocracy of Rome, to which Boethius belonged, and allow these aristocrats to get on with their own lives as they wished. And that was fine for Boethius for most of his life. He, on the one hand, took part in the Roman ceremonial, but it had no real meaning because the Romans had no power anymore. But on the other hand, he dedicated himself to a certain sort of learned leisure. Now, because he was a member of the highest aristocracy, he had what was very unusual for those times, an education which involved his learning Greek thoroughly and coming into full contact with Greek culture as well as Roman culture. It also meant that he had access really to whatever manuscripts he wanted. And he then spent most of the years of his life doing philosophy in Latin. Philosophy normally had been done in Greek, but he would do it in Latin and make available to people who didn't read Greek some of the treasures of Greek philosophy. He started off by working on what we call the arts of the quadrivium, the mathematical arts of arithmetic, music, and probably astronomy. And he then went on to he announced an enormously ambitious program. He was going to translate into Latin all the dialogues of Plato and all the works of Aristotle, and comment on them, and show how, this was typical for the time, those two great thinkers were really in harmony, despite appearances to the contrary. In fact, he spent his time translating and commenting on Aristotle's logical works, and so he produced this large corpus of logical translation and commentary, which would have an enormous effect on medieval philosophy, especially up to and including the 12th century. Boethius, like all the Roman aristocracy of his time, was a Christian. There was no question about that. Everybody around were Christians. But he was a Christian layman. He wasn't a priest. Nonetheless, he involved himself a bit in some of the theological controversies of the time, and he produced a set of what are called 5 opuscula sacras, short works on theological topics. And so all this had happened by the early 520s. So Boethius is in his mid-40s. And then Theoderic decided, because Boethius was well known as an important person and well known as being very intelligent, that he would ask him to give up his life of leisure and become, in effect, his prime minister. Boethius agreed, but it was a disaster. He soon got involved in court intrigue. Moreover, there was a great deal of suspicion by the Goths at this stage directed towards Romans like himself, because they were afraid that these Romans might cooperate with the Byzantines. The Byzantines, i.e. the Eastern Roman Emperor, were getting more and more hostile to Theodoric, and it seemed as though people like Boethius could be an enemy in the midst of the Goths. As a result, Boethius found himself thrown into prison, accused of treason, among other things, and awaiting execution. And nothing could be done to remove this sentence. It was during this time that he wrote his most famous work of all, the Consolation of Philosophy, and it's the work with which we're going to be concerned. The Consolation of Philosophy takes the form of a dialogue between, like, Boethius the character, and we need to distinguish between Boethius the character and Boethius the author, and a figure of philosophy who is, if you like, a personification of the philosophical tradition of Greece and Rome. And it's for philosophy to convince Boethius, who is plunged, or depicts himself as being plunged into despair at his sudden fall from a position of great fortune and eminence to that of a man imprisoned and awaiting execution, to convince him that it's not the case that God has no care for human beings, nor is it the case, as his own example might seem to illustrate, that the good are made to suffer and the wicked prosper. And we won't go into the details of how she does that, but that's what philosophy does in books 1 to 4. Our interest, though, is especially in book 5. So by book 5, philosophy has made her main point. And then Boethius, the character, poses her a problem about divine prescience, whether the fact that God knows all things, so he knows the future, doesn't mean that human beings don't have any free will. And so the whole basis for judging them morally disappears. That's the problem there. And we're going to go on to look at that, but not before we've looked at a different subject, which we need to take into account in order to understand Boethius' discussion. And this is the whole question of divine eternity. So that's what I'm going to go on to.